I'm Suman Jagdev. I'm a partner with Xynteo, based out of our Mumbai office. Welcome everyone to the panel discussion today titled Sustainable Skylines, Decarbonizing the Built Environment. What promises to be a rich conversation with four eminent industry leaders. One of our panelists, Deeksha, is running late. She'll be joining us in a few minutes. To set the context, the built environment, which encompasses real estate and infrastructure, contributes to about 40% of global carbon emissions, thus necessitating urgent action to decarbonize our construction and building operations and actually build scalable solutions to address that. Now, from our experience working in this sector, we've seen there are several market-ready levers which not only have abatement potential, but also are cost-effective. And it's up to the companies and the value chain to actually be able to derive value from them. This session will address the critical need to decarbonize construction and cities with a very linear focus on value chain collaboration through innovative approaches and actually coming up with solutions which meet the three key criteria of availability, reliability, and cost effectiveness. The panel will also share insights on building codes and policy frameworks, sustainable materials, and holistic solutions to inform and inspire stakeholders across construction, urban planning, and policy. We will deliberate the next kind of 45 minutes on the topic and then open it up for Q&A. Hi, Deeksha. No problem. So with that, I would quickly want to introduce our panelists today. We have Darshana Myronidis, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer for Virgin. We have James Drinkwater, Chair of the Investment Committee at Built by Nature and Head of Built Environment, Laudes Foundation. We have Deeksha Vats, Group Chief Sustainability Officer at the Birla Group, and Grainger, Global Head of Sustainability Services and ESG and JLL. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you to the panelists for taking the time to be here today and share your insights. Just to kick off the conversation, I think policy is a very important aspect of driving decarbonization across sectors and specifically in the built environment as well. How do we, at the end of the day, navigate situations where policy lacks innovation and is not really setting the right ambition or enabling transition? And the second part of that conversation would be, as the private sector, how can it actually deliver tangible proof points on the ground to influence policy and also establish credibility on low carbon solutions? So maybe, James, we can kick it off with your views on the landscape, what you're seeing in your work with the government, with the private sector.
Sure, thank you. I've got two great examples from recent history. So we've been doing a lot of work in Europe on embodied carbon with the EU, where a lot of the industry leaders are saying we want more regulatory clarity, we're ready to deliver, and bar a few countries that have set some regulatory trajectory, there's been relatively little clarity. There isn't that demand pull for low carbon materials. So two recent projects. One is called Building Life, and it's taken its inspiration from a process the Swedish government and industry ran, where government brought in Skanska to run a coalition of about 100 players across the entire value chain, supply and demand side, to say, well, as developers, designers, product manufacturers, investors, etc., here's the solution set we have, here's what we know needs doing, here's the infrastructure, environmental product declarations and so on, we need to evolve across the public and private sector. And this roadmap of very clear actions with very clear timelines for different players was largely adopted in this regulatory trajectory. Now, we and our friends at the IKEA Foundation have sort of, a great idea should be copy-pasted, have funded large cross-industry coalitions in 10 European countries to do that same process. Present the solution set, curate market confidence, say this is where we need regulation, this is where we need incentives, this is where we can move as the market by ourselves, and this is what we need people to do at different times. And that's led to the EU setting a law that will bring in mandatory whole life carbon assessment in a couple of years and whole life carbon limits, effectively regulating embodied carbon in new building by 2030. Now, it's a long way off, sure, but there's a clear sort of trajectory now. Another project called the Indicate program has brought together industry that have LCA data on projects with the academia, the kind of technical universities that work with government on policy design, and advocacy NGOs to actually say, well, for setting the right benchmarks and then limit values, because governments aren't sure how to do this, here's how to do this. We're the industry, we have the data. Here are the trusted partners of government, the technical universities. Here are the advocacy organizations to make sure it's heard. And ahead of that new regulatory trajectory, they're saying, here's how you set benchmarks and carbon limits. And it's copy-pasting, again, what the Denmarks and Netherlands and some of the Nordics have done for a while into Czechia, to Spain, to Ireland, and so on. So these, I think, are great examples of how you can work to really set the trajectory very clearly.
Thank you, James. I think great example. I think specifically about whole life carbon, that's a concept where a lot of the industry is still doing a bit of catching up on. We're still linearly, a lot of focus is on operational carbon. I think the entire combination of operational and embodied is what is needed to measure, monitor, and then kind of push the needle on that. Guy, over to you. Your views being a key player in this sector.
So yeah, I tend to roll my eyes a little bit when business says, oh, we need more policy, because actually business does need to take the lead on this. And it's far easier for business to take the lead than it is for policy makers, because business tend to be subject matter experts, as James just gives clear examples. So I think it's really incumbent on leadership to come forward and to collaborate with peers and make a recommendation. And usually policymakers will respond to that, if I'm honest, but it doesn't happen very often. I think we're in a great example here in New York, which has probably one of the more controversial policies come into place with Local Law 97, which has its flaws, right? I think it's really well intentioned, but it has its flaws. So if you just leave it up to policymakers, then one, it's likely to be clumsy, and also it might not, actually have the final outcome that you want. And it is much easier for business leaders to do this than it is for policymakers. So I think there is a huge responsibility for leaders to be leaders in this field. And it's the one area where our industry struggles is on collaboration, because it involves compromise. And actually, when you see more of that, I think we'll find the right solutions for the built environment, particularly for existing buildings, which is where the real problem is how do we decarbonise existing buildings that rely on fossil fuels, particularly in the domestic situation in terms of multifamily residential.
Thank you, Guy. Over to you, Deeksha, just from the standpoint of India and broadly as a growth market, your views on how the interplay between policy and the private sector is panning out and is expected to pan out going into the future.
So I think I'll use two examples to what he spoke about, and then how, at least over last almost a decade and a half, we've seen things moving, say, for example, in the cement sector, because as Aditya Birla Group in built environment, we have presence, we have a fairly established cement business, which is the largest cement maker in the country. We have a relatively new real estate business, and absolutely new. We've just about started to sell a paints business. So we see it from these three perspectives, and what we've seen is that we were part of cement sustainability initiative of WBCSD when it started, and how in last 6 to 8 years the conversation shifted from CSI becoming GCCA, the Cement and Concrete Association, which then broadened the horizon to say that change needs to happen at the application level and not just at manufacturing level. So, in addition to how one makes, what one makes, and how it gets used is very, very important. And then where one makes. So I think all of these pieces become important. It's like saying that business leading policy or policy leading business becomes very contextual. Just yesterday when we had this conversation, there was a roundtable that I was part of where we were talking about how investors and corporates can engage better. And I was reflecting on a question that was asked by one of the ESG analysts a couple of months back on how our cement business, or when is our cement business going to take absolute emission reduction targets? And, to understand that in a cement sector, at this point, almost 60% of the solutions are yet to be found in the cement making process. But when we're talking about, we have ready-mix concrete, so the kind of solutions that you can apply there. And in India, for example, in India, I mean, from what I remember in my conversation with cement colleagues, the price of cement is almost a fifth or maybe a sixth of what it is here in US. Therefore, the kind of play that you have in terms of the neo technologies that you can bring in is very, very different. And which is why I think all three would need to, whether it's about the finance, policy, and technology, all three need to come together while not equally at all points in time for a change to sustainably happen. Otherwise, they just remain as some pilots or some conversations. So that's where I would leave it.
Interesting. I think in terms of cement specifically, as we have seen, at least in the Indian context, there are substitutes available today. Maybe it's a combination of lack of awareness or lack of confidence. There are misconceptions in terms of their performance, meeting their performance standards. Yeah. Is that a problem to solve for as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and that's what I mean by to build on the whole conversation on application level, that, you know, you need not make everything with OPC, like, you know, the kind of this whole misconception of that it will be stronger or it will be longer lasting. So application-based standards become more and more important, and therefore, yes, that's something that needs further working on.
Thanks, Deeksha. Darshana, what do you, as a conglomerate with diverse interests, how do you see the real estate bit of it panning out, and how do we decarbonize that?
I think the decarbonizing question is a hard one, right? And I hear my panelists, but I think JLL has a guy I align most to your thinking. In terms of policy, I think that the policy shift is always going to be really slow. And we've seen that from the EU as well, where we're sort of, I think, drowning ourselves in regulation to the point of where sustainability loses innovation. From a corporate perspective, these are my own points of view as well as what we're trying to drive at Virgin. We have a huge portfolio in terms of hotels, limited edition properties, and then obviously you look at some of our portfolio like Virgin Active, which is all the built environment. I think corporates have a space to play in terms of that innovation, in terms of where we're actually taking the next agenda. But I think it always comes down to financing, and we're not actually looking at some of the other players in the market, which is individuals who hold huge portfolios, who just run their huge portfolios as machines, I suppose. And so they're not looking at anything in sustainability in terms of criteria, but their bottom line in terms of actually what return are their portfolios giving them. When you start to look at a market, these individuals tend to be, specific sort of, portfolio groups, normally in the investment space or PE. And so the reality is I feel the regulation has to stop moving from just policy that's just targeted overall, but start to look at actually how are you sort of identifying what a large company is, because I think what you'll find is when you start looking at the regulation, they speak to large companies and they speak to, small to medium entities. And then there's an entire gap in between of where the regulation doesn't touch. And that amount of wealth that sits in there, the amount of impact that sits in that gap, is where we need to target next in order to make a change.
Thank you, Darshana, for those insights. Just shifting tax a bit, if you look at circular economy models, I think that's pretty much becoming prevalent along with decarbonization initiatives across sectors. Now, while there is some traction that we're seeing in this construction space as well, there's still some distance to go. So how do we actually accelerate creation of a circular economy model within construction? And what are the barriers to overcome in terms of infrastructure, customer adoption, policy? Would be just good to understand. Maybe, Guy, we can start with your views on this. Yeah.
So I think when it comes to circularity, it gets much more localized, if I'm honest, in terms of the supply chain, the availability, but also in terms of the stakeholders. So you've got whether it be planning authorities or insurers or warranties to these materials. There is a knowledge gap, and it is really hard to bridge. So you have to spend a significant more amount of time when you're trying new things with reused materials as opposed to brand new materials. So I think in terms of construction, you'll find the more entrepreneurial developers driving a pathway there. What it results in is a product which is far more inspirational, to be honest. We are doing a lot of work on fit-outs within buildings, particularly workplaces, because actually over the life of a building, the fit-out in that building can account to a significant proportion of the whole life carbon. And actually, that's where you can create real impact, because a lot of the materials in fit-outs, whether it be workplaces, residential, are wasted, right? And there is no kind of design of end of use. But if you put that in place, and we're starting to do it in our own portfolio, we've got 400 offices worldwide, but we're also putting it in place for some of our corporate accounts. It's amazing how quick the learning curve is. It's amazing how quick you attract a supply chain that you can repeat. So it's really important to give demand signals out there, not just for the supply chain, but also for the insurers, for the planners, for everyone. But a great place to start is inside the buildings, I would say. Yeah. That is a brilliant place to start, because there is a lot of embodied carbon there, and amazing stories result. You get an incredible narrative for the users, whether it's in residential or workplaces or hotels. It's amazing how much more inspirational it is if the table or the chair or the carpet or the fittings, you can tell a story about where they've come from and how they've been reused. Actually, you'll find that the customers and the users are likely to occupy that space even more. So there's a real benefit, I think, in telling the story, but also kind of sending strong demand signals out to the market.
Could I just come in there just to say something? Yeah. So that's very relevant to a project we've just completed, which is we've built and retrofitted a building in central London, which is going to be our forever home in Virgin. But in terms of from a corporate trying to be responsible, what we did when we were building and retrofitting was to set ourselves a recycle rate in terms of reuse. So to meet a sort of a minimum of a 35% recycle rate from our current office, to be able to, reuse and use sustainable materials along the process. We worked with a company that's going to give us an impact report at the end of the day in terms of how sustainable our materials are, and then I set sort of emissions caps from how far we can actually source materials, and in terms of where that supply chain is sourced. I think if we have to take apart everything and put it back together and think about how we make those in a more sustainable way to be able to end up then with what good looks like.
No, absolutely. I think while we talk about forward-leaning organizations actually taking a bit of a pioneering role here, at the end of the day, how do we ensure that the construction and demolition waste is not really landing up in landfills and actually being recycled to produce meaningful products which meet performance requirements? So any views on that, James? Yeah.
I mean, I'm staggered in Europe where we fund a lot of initiatives, something like 1% of all products actually end up being reused. And I just point out, I mean, for some really great summary reports, the Ellen MacArthur's recent report, Building Prosperity, does a fantastic, here are the barriers, here are the solution sets, because I think they're known, but the kind of institutional infrastructure to scale this up in the market isn't there. So we've helped a group of the key organizations in this space. World GBC, Audrey's there, WBCSD, Ellen MacArthur Foundation, Arab have been coming in to help, and Metabolic and Circular Economy, to form a thing called the Circular Buildings Coalition. And they're seed funding some of the initiatives that are dealing with some of these institutional barriers. So insurance, they're seed funding a startup called Concula in Germany that's now looking at insurance products, right? Again, who's got the duty of care for reused products, the risks there. There is no standardized insurance kind of set of product set for these sorts of things. So they've been working on recovered construction material insurance products with one of the key German construction insurers. I think they're called VHV in Germany. to start to, again, look at, well, what could standard products look like here? And we've experienced, again, insurance has been one of the major barriers. We do a lot of work in circular bio-based construction in the London market. Insurance was really killing the use of lots of these newer materials. And a lot of the developers actually started to look at putting in a lot of money to an insurance captive vehicle, putting their own kind of capital at risk to almost circumvent the traditional insurance market. Fortunately, saved loads of fees because they realized actually it's not really an institutional problem, it's an individual problem, actually taking insurers through the risks, helping them understand how you guard against this. And there's some great work come out in the London market, a guidebook essentially for insurers to walk them through from the very early stage using these products. We still lack lots of the data so that people can price the risk effectively, but yeah, I think there's more work needed on this insurance piece.
Thanks, James. Deeksha, very quickly, and the percentage which James mentioned, the 1 to 2%, I know is pretty consistent in India as well. That's the percentage of C&D waste which essentially gets recycled. Any views on how we can drive that process more from a demand and a supply side as well?
Yeah, so there are a few things. I mean, I think circularity, one thing we kind of need to remember is it's a means and not an end in itself. So therefore, what are you trying to make circular for? And we've started to look at it, for example, for our aluminium business, Novelis, we've just last evening announced that we use, right now, 63% of the aluminium that Novelis uses is recycled, and by 2030, we want to take it to 75%. And Novelis is talking about it as a lever to decarbonize. So similarly, in our cement business, we are talking of circularity as a lever for two things, essentially. One is to kind of bring down the carbon footprint, but also for resource security. And I guess that's where construction and demolition waste fits in, that how can we use parts of it to kind of, fit in for coarse aggregate, fine aggregate, whichever part that it would fit in the concrete or at the cement end of the business. What we've seen, whether it's, we have been doing a lot of work on circularity in different parts of our, because I work for a conglomerate, and we have seen that a big barrier is the reverse logistics and the cost to bring it in. And I guess what has worked very well for us when our cement business started to use the red mud or the bauxite residue from our aluminium business as a substitute for laterite and lithomarge. What worked was when we were able to work with the railways to let, like what is happening for fly ash as a cementitious material or as a pozzolanic material, if it can be done for construction and demolition waste as well, then that would be one big push, that you can move it around in larger quantities at a lower cost. So things like that, and also, so this is on the supply side, but also on the demand side, again, to say that, which grades of concrete for which application, where we could put in to say that this is coming in from construction demolition waste, this part. So I guess all of these need to come together for it to scale up and become sustainable, and then for Ultratech to have these targets like Novelis to say that X% of my these aggregates come from construction.
Recycled, yeah. Right. Yeah. Interesting. I think that's a good segue to the entire discussion between retrofitting and new builds. There are two potential decarbonization approaches. And while retrofitting might seem like the more obvious choice in the short term, but how do you make the right choice, taking into consideration cost, operation efficiency, and effectiveness as well from a carbon footprint standpoint? And how can policy as well as technology play a role in enabling this decision making and help in arriving at the right decision? Darshana, probably we can start with you. You mentioned about one of your projects and retrofitting playing an important role.
Yeah, so I think, look, the focus at the moment is retrofitting specifically because we have a global portfolio. And I think in that specific example of where Virgin are at, what I'm seeing is a clear policy shift depending on your geography. So it differs per state in the US, where we're going to be pushed in terms of is policy, our standards actually meeting our guidelines. So we have developed our own guidelines and our own standards to be able to come in at the highest level that we want to see. And we don't wait for the state to help drive that in terms of a policy perspective. But then we're also seeing that the UK and EU care much more in terms of the regulation that's being driven in the built environment than Australia and South Africa. Now, there's a conversation to be had as well, which I think Deeksha touched upon, which is there's an entire lower income developing country context who are still growing and have to be able to be given the chance to grow to the levels that the global north are at. And I'm South African, if everybody didn't know or couldn't hear in my accent. And so I very much think about that developing country context, which is, I think there's an element there that is, the policy is not going to drive the discussion from an Africa perspective or from an India perspective, right? And so what we're seeing currently as a company is how do we, as a private company, start driving those decisions and ignoring the noise around us in terms of everything else? Because for ourselves, we've set a standard in terms of our purpose of changing business for good. Everybody else is not there yet, but the reality is that it's still even hard having those discussions as a company who have that purpose in mind as our North Star. What I would like to see in the near future is more subsidies type processes to be able to start to elevate these discussions, to be able to start supporting companies in these journeys and start to I think, experiment with what circularity truly looks like, in the built environment space.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Guy, any views from your standpoint?
Well, I think it's really important that the developing nations really learn from the mistakes we've made in the developed nations. And developing buildings individually without a connected system is unbelievably inefficient. And it is no accident that a city like Copenhagen will be first to net zero versus kind of a city like New York or London, right, where there are no connected energy, heating, cooling systems, and obviously there are bigger buildings in the Londons and New Yorks, but actually a big part of this is connecting up the energy supply so that it's much more efficient and having sort of single sources of energy that are more secure and delivering for a lot more users. And that's particularly relevant for sort of low-income households as well. So I think there are massive learnings there, including around circularity and the scarcity of water and things like that, which are really important when you're developing big cities. And I think the developed world has probably got as big, if not a bigger challenge, which is all the existing buildings and how to repurpose them in a profitable, sustainable way over a period of time. It can be done by design, but it has to be done with intention. So, really intrigued to see the pace at which this goes. And, out of the developed world, I'm seeing the first signals, actually, that North America might speed up at the jeopardy of Europe because we're stuck. I totally agree in an administrative nightmare of reporting, which is just actually tying the hands of innovation and speed in a big way. So at the same time, you've got very devolved cities here who are driving new agendas around buildings with building performance standards and energy use intensity, and a real feeling, I'd say, in North America that energy is scarce and we have to plan for that really, really well. And probably the biggest subsidy package in the world, which kind of helps as well to what you said about subsidies. So really interested to see how we're all obsessed by cities in this room, I think, how the developing world kind of learns from the mistakes and how the developed world uses different policy and different entrepreneurial spirit to speed up or slow down, depending on where you are.
And if I can just add in, I mean, I think it's great we're having a debate about this. You could just knock something down, build a new net zero building, and hurrah, and we've realised the maths of that doesn't quite add up in a carbon-constrained world. I mean, it blows my mind in Europe. We've got something like 11 million empty homes. Right? We're not talking second and third homes, we're talking empty homes. Now, there's a chunk, bottom third, really hard to treat, retrofit. Middle chunk, you know, it could be done, and then some that, you know, can be commercially turned and retrofitted easily. And the right incentive suite so we can tap into a large amount of that, because, you know, the house building targets we're setting in European countries, they all use the entire economy's remaining carbon budget, right? So that actually, the right incentive suite is really, really critical there. And then the economics of retrofitting a lot of assets is really impossible. We're working with a lot of people on how to increase floor space, particularly in kind of multi-story buildings with lightweight top-ups to add floor space, turn assets, and make the economics of deep renovations doable, because they're virtually impossible a lot of the time unless you're actually adding that sort of value. So again, these typologies that look at new lightweight construction, adding floor space to make the economics of retrofit work, key. But yeah, it's great we're finally having this debate, I think.
Thanks, Jim. I think just coming to you, Deeksha, just from India standpoint, as a developing country where a lot of new buildings are expected to come in the next probably 5 to 6 years, it's going to be a lot of new builds versus probably retrofitment in proportion to, say, any developed country. Any views on this entire dichotomy in terms of how can a country look at this? Yeah.
So I guess what is very different while, you know, we're talking about the Western world versus, say, Asia, it's just the sheer number of people who need to be housed, who've been not living in proper housing. So I think it would be a lot more of this newer housing, because people just, so many of them they're not even living in proper houses. So I guess it would be a lot around how do we build newer housing which can house more people more efficiently, using so better design and policy around that, and therefore bespoke to that, and rather than just trying to kind of copy, because that's another thing which is not been so great in last few decades, is to come up with these modern building with glass facades which are not even suited for the weather there, for the kind of energy availability there, or even just general well-being. So I think a lot around it needs to be done at all of those levels to say, are we choosing the right designs which are suited for both weather, actually for all three things, weather, demographics, and costing, in that sense.
Absolutely. I think the insights and recommendations are spanning across the building life cycle, really, starting from design to actually end of life. Very relevant inputs. Now, in terms of, if you just look at the numerous stakeholders which span the entire construction value chain, often the responsibility for decarbonization or carbon intensity reduction is diffused, leading to lack of action. So how can regulations and policies make sure that they are addressing whole life cycle carbon in a way that responsibilities are very clearly assigned, and then there are deterrents for non-compliance as well? Maybe we can start with you, James. Any thoughts on that? Yeah.
Sure. I love your asking this question. I don't have all the answers, but I think, you know, all of us have been involved in several decades now of the sort of leaders lead initiatives, and we haven't scaled into a mainstream market yet. It's why we're all here. You know, 1% of construction materials being reused. And so I now actually think for all of these leaders lead initiatives that we're all involved in, I'm not talking punitive regulations and fines as enforcement mechanisms here. I'm talking about what are the nudges that are designed not at the hope-based strategy end, you know, set high ambition targets and we all say we'll get there, but at the enforcement nudge end. Like, as industry peers, now it's incumbent on us. The only way we win is to start designing that into process, right? And I think we're doing a piece of work with a consortia of our partners, the Green Finance Institute, IIGCC, Green and others, who are coming together to set out what good transition plans look like for different actors in our sector, but also not just think about, again, setting the high ambition strategy, start to say, well, as industry, what do we need the enforcement nudges to look like if we're not doing that? I mean, again, I talked about the example of these national roadmaps that have been established across Europe, and Audrey, sitting in the front line there, has been very involved in these. But, you know, what happens in these large membership organizations when by 2025 the actions we all said we would have taken haven't been done by the majority of those who signed up? Like, what are these enforcement mechanisms so we create a cultural norm of, you've got to, if we've said it's possible, and some of us have shown we've done it, what happens there? So I think I don't have answers very explicitly, but transition plans, showing what good looks like, but really thinking about that accountability and enforcement mechanism. As industry, I'm not even talking about the regulatory piece here, is going to be critical in the next little while. We've got a report coming out by a research organization called Autonomy in October that's looking at actually some of these enforcement nudges and tweaks that we now need to start embedding everywhere in our Leaders Lead initiative. So I love that you're asking this question. Sorry, I don't have the...
I can see a few people taking notes, and I'm listening to you, James. Enforcement nudges. I kind of like it, but I think it's a little bit... I know you don't live in the UK now, but I still think it's a bit British. Yeah. It's just not...
Dutch Colombian now.
Dutch Colombian. Yeah, I think you need to be a bit more Dutch. The Dutch wouldn't say that. They'd be much more forceful. They'd be like, a nudge isn't quite good enough. And actually, this is where I think the engagement between an owner and an occupier needs to, like, completely transform itself, right? I think the leases of old have been a big problem in terms of actually having a joint sort of equity involvement in decarbonising a building. It's either them or us, right? Because there's this restrictive covenant between them which has a financial obligation. And it's really interesting to see that some owners are starting to disrupt that slightly and to get into a space where it's a far more engaged relationship during the life of the occupancy, rather than a really highly engaged relationship up until you sign the lease, hand the keys over, don't talk to them until like 12 months before that lease is up, which is kind of how most of our occupier clients explain their relationship with their landlords, which is like, they're really lovely people up until you sign the lease, and then it's just awful, right? So I think that needs to really transform itself, and I think it's, you know, there's a danger that investors will talk to themselves in an echo chamber and occupiers will talk to themselves in an echo chamber, and we need to kind of crunch that bit together. But I will read that research about enforcement nudges but I think, you know, I'd love to see what the lease of 2030 looks like, and I hope it's a bit different of the lease of 2020.
Sure. Darshana, what do you thoughts on that?
I'm going to go full South African because I think we need a carbon tax. And I think everyone just should have internal carbon pricing, and then every company should have a carbon tax built in. Because the reality is, otherwise you're not making the right decisions. So we launched yesterday, as part of Virgin Unite and the Rockstrom Foundation, the Planetary Health Check, which, when you consider that the built environment is responsible for 40% of emissions, you're responsible for the tipping point that is actually causing your planetary boundaries to tip. When you consider now that the science is there to be able to show that we've actually, in the tipping point, we don't have a point of return, the conversation does need to change from nudges or policy or small steps of what each of us can do and stop working in silos, but each of us to just build into our general operating models that here's the tax, this is your cost of being in business, this is your business as usual now, and a 1.5 degree world is what we're living in. Therefore, in order to actually stop us from getting from the 2.7 degrees, we need to do these things now.
Thank you. Deeksha, views from your side.
Yeah, no, I guess that's the thing of going last. I think I agree with many of this, but from the perspective of, I think, say if we were to talk about how do we accelerate that in India, I think getting this balance of two things. One is the whole supply demand, that the, say, public green procurement kind of a thing. So that would, at least the public buildings that are coming up, that could be would set as an example of how both in terms of the cost of making, cost of living, and maybe even third thing, cost of cost of carbon being considered there. So those could be examples, and then from the demand side push, and then through getting all these stakeholders on the table to the point that he talked about, that ultimately the beneficiary of the energy cost coming down when you build it in an efficient way, the upfront cost is being borne by the real estate person. So how do you get everyone on the table to say this is how overall it's going to work out? That's something which I've been hearing a lot of conversations with many of these coalitions coming together in last almost a decade, but I don't have an answer for you right now.
Interesting. I think we'll follow that space closely, and as we also end up doing more work in this space and working with stakeholders across demand, supply, technology solution providers, philanthropic organizations like yours, James, I'm sure we'll evolve into developing some perspectives which are a lot more crystallized. Absolutely. So just coming to probably our last kind of segment, looking at offsets. Now, how does that fit into construction as a sector? And what are the risks of looking at offsets versus directly addressing emissions? And if you look at some of the interventions around nature, biodiversity, how does the sector at the end of the day address residual emissions in a way that it's integral to impact measurement as it's evolving? So any views on that? Probably, Guy, we can start with you.
I've probably got a strong view because we've signed up for Science-Based Targets initiative. Yeah. So I'm going to go a bit South African, if you don't mind. I think any organisation that is offsetting more than 10% of their footprint is not credible. And I think that's quite a lot of organisations out there doing that at the moment. That's very, very subjective view from me. But I think over time, there's going to be more transparency on this, and I feel like that's not the way to get there.
Sure. Darshana, you were saying something here.
Yeah, so we've committed our intent to Science-Based Targets initiative at a group level, which means that across our 32 different companies, when they accept our targets, near and long term, we will be on that same journey. I think that the reality is, in terms of offsetting, I'm very much an absolute emissions reduction person. Now, for aviation industry, that's quite difficult to do. So they're intensity-based, but for everybody else, it's sort of, here's the rule, here's the measurement, and let's go. In terms of sort of the 10%, absolutely believe in that, but even those 10%, right now, what I'm finding is the market lacks integrity. The voluntary carbon market space really is, I think it's a free-for-all. And so myself tomorrow could invest in something and sign up and start up my own offsetting business, which I might do. And it could be in my back garden. But the reality is that's what we actually need more of. So if you are going to offset, we need more policy and regulation around offsetting the calculation and what's going to happen. But nobody should be calling themselves, what is now a term we don't use, carbon neutral.
Yeah.
Or, carbon positive, or any type of regeneration, if they don't meaningfully have a strategy pathway, OPEX, CAPEX, towards a full decarbonization plan.
Understood. Any views on, for example, the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Based Financial Disclosures? Does that help in a way moving the needle in that direction? Companies who have signed up for that? Yeah.
I think it's added on another layer of work for what the Chief Sustainability Officer has now is multiple hats. Yeah. And to be honest, at some point, I'd need to bring in a nature person specifically focused on the TNFD. I think the reality is I'm not working at a pace of where regulation's pushing us. We're looking at actually how do we, for our business, work ahead of regulation, ahead of best practice, and we sort of dull out the outside noise. And so the TNFD is super important. I think the SBTNs are important in terms of the driving the sort of nature agenda, but I also think let's not forget that we're, super sort of water intensive in the built environment industry as well. And so when we're starting to build together all of these strands, I think there's an element of somebody needs to look at it and think holistically, actually, what are each of these agendas driving? And to have a seat at the table in terms of nature is super important. But I think we need to take it on a sort of case-by-case, portfolio-by-portfolio basis.
Sure, thanks for that. Deeksha, any thoughts as a conglomerate? I know certain businesses have signed up for TNFD, but specifically from a built environment standpoint.
No, so for us, TNFD we've started to do both at our aluminium business and at the cement business as well, because we started to work on biodiversity with IUCN almost a decade back, and therefore in terms of having that mitigation hierarchy in place. But I guess offsets both from the perspective of, and I'll talk about it, them coming in as a solution, but also as a nudge to pick up projects which we would have not otherwise done. SBTi for cement is not accepting of offsets, so that is one thing there. And when we talk about internally, and that I'm talking about, they're talking about both whether it's a CCUS or a nature-based solution, so that's a debate out there. But overall, what TNFD has done is that it's brought focus to some of these projects which used to be, the people in the plant, let the horticulturists look at it, or let these people who are doing forestry, in mining, that team. It's kind of mainstreaming that to say, okay, we are doing these mangroves here, or this tree plantations here. How do they count for in terms of the efforts that we would make otherwise, whether it's in terms of the no net loss target that we have, and how our no net loss target talks to our net zero target. So those conversations have now started to happen. There's a lot more clarity. There's a lot more clarity, which is also started to come up with some of these smaller things that have started to come in regulations. For example, Government of India started to talk about green credits in parallel to carbon credits. So which sits in where, and therefore, can we look at some of these as structured programs rather than these standalone site-based initiatives? That's a change that has happened now.
James, you want to say
Can I add
something?
briefly? I find offsets so interesting in terms of where principles meets pragmatism, right? Some residual emissions, you need to be pragmatic about that. On the principles basis, nature's our best friend here, right, as the global economy. I get quite worried when I hear about, in the construction sector, we're thinking about offsetting by creating pool funds that somehow pay for building renovation. And I'm like, as a pragmatist, that sounds like a great idea, but you're sort of baking a market failure or a problem into the solution. That doesn't feel like a great way to head longer term. So I think we've got to be really cautious, and again, why nature's our best friend. And then maybe to, be the voice of philanthropy and kind of look where we're going. We've got to do some offsetting, short to net zero. We've all got to kind of wake up and look at, there's an enormous amount of carbon sequestration that's going to be needed on top of the journey to net zero. So I think, one of the reasons we set up Built by Nature and the Climate Smart Forest Economy program was to say, how do you create value chains which over the next 100 years look at, well, how do housing value chains become net investors in nature over the next 100-year cycle? We tend to cut the world off at 2050, don't we, in our movement? And having been in this for a while, I can't help but think we're going to hit 2.5 degrees. So resilience has been a key word here. How do we start to claw that back? It is a really important long-term strategy, and how do we set up value chains that do this? So I'd be happy to talk to anyone more about the work we're doing here afterwards, but yeah.
Absolutely, James. Thanks for that. We can probably now open the floor to questions and spend the next 10 minutes doing that. Yeah, I think we have.
Right. Thank you very much for coming to share your insights. My name is Thomas. I run a sustainability strategy firm that helps investors and business leaders green companies and real estate for higher returns. Now, I'm sitting here and I'm getting very excited and I'm getting a little perplexed because there seems to be something that is always coming away in the way of my work and in my work as in together with the companies I team up with. And it feels like it's something around pulling all of this together. That there are a lot of great pieces out there, some that are really excellent, but you can have an arm and a leg, but you need to give them a full body to give a greater sense. And just, sorry, I'm going a bit more on context, but I'd like to share this with you so that you can maybe help point me in a better direction, because I've worked on creating green leases for investment banking headquarters, or setting up a greening repositioning strategy for companies like Google, or upgrading global portfolios for companies like NASDAQ on the building side. And we've tried to tie that up to the company objectives. And one thing I find there is that if you speak with the sustainability teams at these companies, the real estate stuff doesn't often resonate as much with them, because there are other things that are higher on their agenda. Still, if we step back and look at their leased real estate, for example, it's massive, to your point, Guy, for example. And then on the other side, I've then explored this on the investor side. So I said, well, let's tap the people that are owning this. And there, what I often find is that they're not always that used to actually speaking about this. It's often a regulation thing, and so it gets moved down to the compliance department. But if you start talking about it in business terms, they start to wake up. It's a little bit the same on the lease side, but I think my question is just, why aren't we seeing more leadership in connecting this together? Like, if we did have a carbon tax, maybe that would raise the water and all the boats. But seeing that we don't have that, is there some other way that we can accelerate the leadership that actually pulls all of these considerations together? Sorry, it was very long-winded, but I find it really challenging, this.
I mean, I had one thought, which was, and I feel you. I have the exact same things when I speak to our more sophisticated portfolios where we have joint ventures and/or have stakeholders and shareholders in the PE firms. For me, I think that we need to go back to criteria, and that's sort of your people and HR teams. If we actually build it into why you're hired as a CEO, why you're hired as a CFO, it's built into your core objectives, which means that the decisions you make are driving what you actually need to do as a business. We currently don't have that embedded in. What we try to drive is actually through each of our team's objectives, the right decision making in terms of we've already codified what our sustainability strategy or purpose is. But I think that's the reason, right? Because people don't often build in actually these qualifying criterias. An investment person's brought in to make money, but if they're brought in to make money in a sustainable way, it changes the conversation.
I'd agree, that's one reason. Interestingly, at our organization, our board I write the sustainability objectives for our executive board. They've got 2 objectives, and their pay is reflected in that, right? It's getting it through the rest of the organization that's really hard. That requires real behavioral change. But to answer your question directly, why isn't this easier? Why is it hard to pull it together? It's one simple system that we work in. It's a capital market system that relies on a 3-year return on investment. And you can't make enough money out of it yet. We have just released some research. We think this is kind of a tipping point in the real estate cycle where values have got to a level where they're low enough and the supply-demand gap is big enough that actually you can make money out of this. But for the last 2 years, in real estate, it's been really hard to make money out of it. If it's hard to make money out of, it's slower. It doesn't get done as quickly, right? The capital market system that we live in and have all benefited from, I'm sure, at some stage in our life, is part of the problem.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this was a very interesting discussion. My name is Anil Sahani. I'm the Global Head of Sustainability for RICS. For those who don't know, it's the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. Going back to what James, you said, we did read the accountability report. RICS this year, July 1, 2024, we have made for 145,000 members globally, they're regulated and mandated to follow our whole life carbon assessment standard, second edition, when they do decarbonization calculations. It's a small step, probably a micro step. Obviously, Thomas is right, we need that bigger glue to connect all these pieces together. We have just soft launched a validation program for carbon calculators. So if you are using a carbon calculator to do decarbonization calculations, at least we can assure that that calculator is aligned with our standard. It's a free standard, open, available to anyone. We are very close to working on an organizational accreditation program also. So if you're an organization claiming that you do decarbonization calculations, again, very micro level, detailed, we could use our validation system for that as well. Now going on to a question, and we have several other pieces of the ecosystem, but we don't have a glue that gets connected. So here's the question. I think as a sector, we are very strong, obviously room for improvement in financial decision making. Our workflows and practices are ingrained into the organization so that when any financial decision has to be made, all the levers start working correctly. But decarbonization right now is very fragmented. It's maybe a designer making decisions, not integrated with cost and carbon calculations. What can be done to ensure that when we make financial decisions, at least we bring forward a clearer picture of decarbonization also, and then make prudent decisions using that kind of a framework in every aspect? Means it could be an infrastructure project, it could be a building, it could be choice of materials, products, systems for your building, new build, retrofit. We have produced a retrofit guide standard for our members also that can be used, but again, there's no decision-making process that puts it into design workflows, construction workflows, and post-construction workflows. It's sitting like an automation island somewhere separately, and we just poke in, get some results, and bring them back. I think that process is needed.
I'll give a quick practical system that we use. We're very lucky to have a purpose team that's led by our Chief Purpose and Vision Officer, who's Holly Branson. They've developed a purpose decision-making filter for the business, which means that any project, procurement, CapEx, any decision has to go through the filter, which covers aspects across environmental, social, governance. In the environmental part, decarbonization is captured. And so we can almost track every decision, and decisions are made or turned down based on their sustainability and purpose criteria.
We have time for one more question. Yeah, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. I'll try to be succinct. My name is David Miller. I'm the Managing Director of C40 Cities' internal think tank, and the author of a book called Solved: How the Great Cities of the World Are Fixing the Climate Crisis. First of all, thank you for the panel. It was fascinating. My question is about existing buildings. There's incredible urgency in this because of the impact this sector has on carbon emissions. And we haven't mentioned 2030 very much, but science shows we need to halve emissions by 2030. So if we're going to do that, it's going to happen in the building sector. And to pick up on what Guy said, particularly with existing buildings. And the biggest obstacle is the fact that people want to use their capital in other ways. Sorry, owners, building owners. Not all of whom are big portfolios, many of whom are smaller companies with limited access to capital. We need to solve the problem you just identified, Guy, in answer to my friend's question over here. How do we solve that problem? Is it by city-based regulation? Is it by government leadership? Is it by nudges? Is it by example? Because if we don't solve that capital market problem, we won't be able to make the change that's needed.
Yeah, why don't I jump in? I suppose there are two ways to get hold of the money to make the interventions and spend the CapEx on the buildings, right? One is using capital, the other is using debt. There is there are no eyes on debt at the moment. I would get far more stringent on the lending criteria towards making the transition happen, rather than the lending criteria at the moment, which focuses on the investing or lending on green product. We need much more lending and a sort of gap in the rate of lending between product that you can transition, that's ready to transition, and other stuff, right? There needs to be a clear gap between the two. I mean, this is a hard one. I think cities can help. I think they can help. I think I've just said the US cities, I think, with their building performance standards, I think they're sending a signal out. But I think we need to grapple with the fact that lenders are not interested. I mean, all the talk about green lending, it's nonsense. It's such a tiny proportion of the market, and it's not green lending on the transition. It's green lending on LEED certified buildings, which is like got nothing to do with carbon emissions. So yeah, I'm a little bit of an activist in the lending space because I think it can be part of the solution. But you know, we're in the center of the banking world here, so well, let's see how much of the conversation it is.
Yeah, I think those are some great ideas. I would say the Green Finance Institute, an organisation doing some good work. But I think, yeah, second the point on debt. I mean, I think it's to that accountability point. It's pretty crazy. Some of our friends in Copenhagen Business School, one of the UK universities, were looking at public listed real estate that has public net zero commitments that has costed in the, you know, how to meet those. There's a real transparency issue here, and there's frankly a need for pressure and enforcement to some degree. Yeah, there's the whole suite of things needed, but yeah, to the debt point, actually the capital is what makes this all happen. So yeah, I'd say.
Thank you, James. Any other questions? We could possibly take them offline. With that, we come to the end of the panel discussion. This has been an extremely insightful conversation and a provocative one as well, which is what we set out to do. And I'm sure all of us here have takeaways that we can follow through on. Extremely grateful to the panelists for taking the time and sharing the deep insights today, and to the audience as well for a positive engagement. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.